This dialogue represents the first public event of the Alliance for Food and Climate Systems Transformation and is co-hosted by Alliance members, University of Pretoria and World Business Council for Sustainable Development. The Alliance is convened and coordinated by MIT J-WAFS and represents a cooperative global effort of 16 research institutions and a growing network of collaborating stakeholder organizations to strategically catalyze research to create a more just, sustainable, resilient, and nutritious food system. These stakeholder collaborations include WBCSD, OECD, WWF, and Just Rural Transition, and our network is growing. Our global network allows us to address some of the most critical knowledge gaps in the food system's climate nexus across a variety of scales and geographies. Our approach is to work with stakeholders throughout the process of identifying systemic barriers and opportunities for transformation, filling knowledge gaps, and scaling solutions. The goal of today's event is to identify priorities around the data needed to support food systems transformation and the monitoring and evaluation of transformation efforts. We have an exciting agenda today that includes a panel of distinguished experts on this topic, followed by breakout sessions where we hope to gather valuable input for the Food Systems Summit process. But first, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Chandra Madramutu. Chandra is a James McGill Professor in the Department of Bioresource Engineering at McGill University and the Director of the McGill Water Innovation Lab. Professor Madramutu's areas of expertise are water management, irrigation, and food security. He's also a visiting professor and visiting scholar in water and food security at MIT. He was the founding director of the Brace Center for Water Resources Management at McGill and created the McGill Institute for Global Food Security, as well as programs in integrated water management, food security, and food safety, and innovation and entrepreneurship. Chandra has supervised the thesis research of over 100 master's and PhD students and has extensive field experience working on water projects in Central Asia, Egypt, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Sub-Saharan Africa, China, and the Caribbean. He was elected to the Canadian Academy of Engineering and is the recipient of the World Irrigation Prize. I would like to hand over the mic to Chandra. Chandra, thank you, Chandra.
Thank you very much for your introduction this morning, Greg, and good morning, everybody, and good afternoon for those who are in another time zone. First of all, it gives me pleasure to be able to participate as a speaker in this independent food systems dialogue. I don't proclaim to have the answers to anything on today's topic with respect to using data for food systems transformation in this dialogue. And you know, I've read on this topic. I've looked at some of the reports from Ernst & Young, recent reports from Ernst & Young. There was another one that was recently produced by NEPAD and IFAD on the use of data for transforming the food system in Africa. And you'll see a lot of recommendations. You'll see that there are a lot of statements which we well know, but in terms of going forward to say that there is a concrete plan of action, there's very little out there. And I think just the sheer breadth of the topic of the food system and also data in the food system, it's just so enormous that it would be almost impossible probably to try and have some very major statement that one could make that would say we're all going to move in a certain direction and take certain actions. When you think about the Food Systems Summit that is being prepared right now through these dialogues, and a plan of action for the year 2030, with only 8 years or so left, it's going to be very difficult. But I think we can probe some of the questions a bit deeper. And I would hope that through my presentation this morning, we would be able to have some discussions and reactions from the panelists, and also further elaboration during the breakout groups. So if we think about the Food Systems Summit, there are the 5 action tracks. And we look at these action tracks, and every single one of them, in order for it to be accomplished and for us to have solid outputs, data is, of course, very critical to every one of these action tracks. It's a cross-cutting theme in very much the same way that we have with respect to Indigenous peoples, minorities, women, and so on, and the environment and ecology. It's cross-cutting right across the system when we look at the 5 action tracks. And also when we look at the SDGs, which Summit is really geared towards how we achieve or move faster at the 18 SDGs, or 17, and if you include the partnerships through collaboration, through partnerships, it's the 18th SDG, then several of those SDGs, whether it be on zero hunger, poverty, life on land, climate action, they're all rooted in some way in being able to have access to data, uniform data that we can draw conclusions from to be able to make any sound judgments about the transformations that are required in the food system. There's one particular one that I wanted to highlight because it is sometimes neglected when we talk about food systems transformation, and that is SDG 12 on ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns. And that gets dropped out of much of our discussion. We tend to focus on the zero hunger, life on land, climate action, but sometimes we forget about sustainable consumption and production patterns, because I think if there's any sector that this really paints to in a very strong way, it is actually the agri-food sector. So, you know, what are some of the key drivers that is causing us to really think about how we can better use data? Certainly changes in diet and shift in consumption patterns. We haven't really come to terms. We make gross estimates about what the demand is, but then we don't often know how we're going to achieve the supply side of that equation. Biodiversity, we've seen the latest report from IPES, came out a couple of years ago on loss of biodiversity and how can we track biodiversity, what data, what indicators we can use to measure how biodiversity is being impacted by our food production systems. That's another driver that we need to think. We are also operating under very scarce resources, particularly land and water. And we make very gross estimates of land and water resources that are available, that are under stress, but we haven't really got very solid indicators of saying how that is going to play out in the future, except gross statements that we know we have to conserve water, we know we have to protect land, but then how do we use data to make decisions about the water resources and the land resources that we need to protect? And of course, with climate change, which is also a big driver at the moment, we keep mentioning about carbon and how can we move to a more carbon neutral economy, and particularly carbon neutral in the agri-food sector, and be able to sequester more carbon within our landscapes. So these are areas where we have data points for sure, and we could make individual decisions that are quite site-specific, location-specific, but don't really allow us to make large-scale decisions with respect to how do we move to a more carbon neutral footprint with data. And as you know, we're very much concerned about evidence-based decision-making, and so we need to have data for that. So, you know, when we think about it, the food system is very large. It's very complex, as you've seen from many of the diagrams that are out there about the food system. It involves many, many stakeholders, not just the producers and not just the consumers, but everybody along that chain of the food supply, the inputs, the outputs, and all of the private actors, the government, all the financially intermediaries. When we think about the trillions of dollars that traverses our economy every day in terms of the global trade around food and the production of food, there's certainly so much fragmentation, and try to bring that complexity together to have a common understanding. It's going to be extremely difficult, but how do we create platforms that would allow us to have all of these players make informed decisions? And there's probably no way we can ever go to one individualized platforms, but obviously a series of pertinent data platforms that we can draw indicators and data from to make some decisions. Because right now we are making, whether we like it or not, the fact of the matter is we are making very short-term decisions in one particular sphere or one particular silo. And we don't know what are the long-term implications of those decisions that could very well create negative impacts in other spheres or silos of the food system. And so that is one of the drawbacks that we have. How easy is it to use existing data points that are out there through crowdsourcing? Can we use crowdsourcing more to be able to get to certain data points that would allow us to make informed decisions, but more importantly, to allow us to achieve scale and impact scale? So, I would like to close by saying that this is a whole area in which there needs to be exactly this kind of dialogue and discussion amongst us. We want to be able to use data so that we can, not just from monitoring and evaluation that we have got in the description of today's dialogue, but we want to go further. We want to use data to create value in the agri-food system. How can we increase the value of the system? How can we create trust particularly amongst consumers who are today looking for more and more data as they buy products and they consume products? And when you think about the complexity of the system in terms of diet diversity and nutrition and human health, consumers are looking for data. They see points of data in certain spheres, but how do you connect the dots between all of those data points to create trust amongst consumers? Integrity of the food system. We do have things like traceability as we look at food quality, as we look at waterborne diseases, foodborne diseases in the food chain. We do have bits and pieces, but only in certain parts of the world where we have that ability to collect the data, synthesize it, process it, and use it in terms of food traceability. But certainly there is going to be a need for platforms that pay much more attention to the integrity of the food system. We don't have to look very far to talk about resilience in supply chains with the current COVID-19 pandemic. And this ties right into the fifth action track of the summit. We want to be able to have access to data that would allow us to build resilience in our supply chains, and also finally to create sustainability in terms of ecosystem protection and preservation, conservation of our air, land, and water resources, protection of our natural resources, our habitats, and of course, biodiversity. So the task is enormous. I think it's a fantastic opportunity through this dialogue to be able to share points of view and to try to come together as we grapple with this. But there's certainly no silver bullet out there. There's no magical bullet that we can all jump on right now, but it's going to take work when we look at all the different areas in which we have resources, and today with all kinds of sensor technologies to be able to collect that data and use it, recognizing that the food system is complex and our geographies are also so different and so complex around the world. So I would like to close on that, Greg and colleagues, and once again to thank you for this opportunity to be able to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Chandra, and thank you for a really engaging keynote. Really appreciate it. I think those some good starting points for some of the breakout sessions too. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Cheryl Hendricks, who will moderate the panel discussion on using data to track food systems transformation. Cheryl is professor and head of the University of Pretoria's Department of Agricultural Economics, Extension, and Rural Development. She's a food security policy expert with extensive experience in policy analysis and program design. Her research and teaching focuses on food security and nutrition policy analysis and monitoring and evaluation of food security at the household, national, and global information systems levels. She's actively engaged in the high-level global food security policy think tanks and panels, and she's a member of the Montpellier Malavo panel and the science group for the 2021 UN Food Systems Summit. Cheryl?
Thank you so much, Greg, and thank you, colleagues, for the opportunity to participate in this exciting event. This is a big day for the Alliance, and I'm pleased to be part of that. We have a lineup of 4 distinguished speakers who will engage as the panel to basically set the start for what we are going to be discussing in the breakaway sessions. So let me start off and introduce each one and ask you please to give us your first opinions of what are the evidence gaps and what are we missing in terms of data in this domain. So the first panelist is Lou Ziska from Columbia University. Lou is a plant pathologist who was formerly with the USDA's Agricultural Research Service. He is very well published, and we have been drawing considerably on his wide experience in the establishment of the Alliance. Lou, would you like to make your opening remarks, please?
Well, thank you very much, Cheryl, for that kind introduction. There are a lot of different issues with respect to understanding the gaps. One of the things that I've been impressed with is the ability of engineering and models to take and look at the physical aspects associated with climate change on yield. So you want to understand about drought, you want to understand about floods, you want to understand about temperature, and those direct impacts with respect to yield and quality of crop systems. But I would argue that there's another half to this. There's another part that does not get the attention that it deserves. And it's complicated, and yet it's incredibly important. And that is the biological constraints that are also going to be impacted, that are already part and parcel of how systems operate. But with the change in climate, those impacts will also resonate in terms of our ability to sustain agriculture and food security moving forward. So understanding that we live in a globe where trade is so part of that background, but that trade can also include the introduction of new invasive species, that those species, once they become established, can have significant impact with respect to the ability to sustain or to produce crops. So you have an incident, for example, of warmer temperatures in the Indian Ocean, which are causing greater precipitation in East Africa, which is producing a new onset of different flowers and different plants, which causes a locust invasion, which then devastates parts of East Africa with respect to food security. There are many other examples that going forward need to have that attention, need to have that investment, need to have that focus if we are really to begin to look at the SDGs and to begin to make sure that those goals can be maintained, particularly the goal of food security. So I think that that quantitative aspect is important in terms of the physical and understanding what the physical changes in climate will mean for crops. But I also think there's a biological constraint that needs additional attention. It's not represented in many of the models that are currently available. And it's complex because it's not a single species, but understanding what those implications are, both with respect to yield, but also with respect to food quality, and food safety are also going to be fundamental moving forward. So thank you, Cheryl.
Thanks, Lou. So these the data on these components is not yet captured in databases that feed into global models, is that?
Correct. That it's
Am I
very
hearing you right?
scarce, and when it is available, it tends to be regional,
Okay.
not global. So I might understand it in my region, but across the
Mm-hmm.
border, I may not see what's going to happen. And as unfortunately, locusts are not required to produce a passport when they cross borders. So that's something that we need to think about.
Okay. Okay. So effect in one place might be geographically causing another place a problem in another place.
Correct.
Okay. Great, great. Okay, thank you for your words and for pointing out a major gap. If I move to our second panelist, Vineet Singh from Digital Green. Thank you so much for joining us. Vineet is the platform architect at Digital Green with over 14 years of experience in developing digital solutions in supply chains, health technology, and agriculture. So you come at this from a very different angle, Vineet. Can you give us your opening remarks in terms of what do you see as the major gaps in the data at the moment?
Yeah, thanks. I think I very much echo the remarks by Liu. And in addition, the focus of Digital Green is for the smallholder producer farmers across globe. And I think there are multiple issues uh, at I think every level. But primarily, if we want to bucket it, I would say at three levels. For the farmer, there's a big issue in terms of because of the change in climate and the way we work with the smallholder farmers, uh, to be able to make a right decision. How do you provide that? We often in Digital Green often refer to as agency to and not just to one, as a collective agency to the entire ecosystem. And what we mean by agency is to be able to choose, act, and sort of influence the realities, and that is where the amount of the level of digital services that are already there. There is an increasing access to those services and those information, but it doesn't lead to that level of agency itself for the farmers, and doesn't lead to any choice. At the second level, I would say the major issue I think is in terms of trust across the ecosystem as well. Trust and compliance. And I think the issue comes because of there's so much of stress on platformization, and there are different platforms that come up. Uh, in the last, I think, a decade and a half, we have seen all these industries that are getting disrupted by different types of platforms, and the platforms come up with their own peculiarities, where a platform needs to grow on the basis of the data that the users generate. And now there's a situation where a platform, let's say any kind of even if we have a learning management solution or platform, uh, the users need to just the data that the users are generating is used by the platform to provide and better services and more customized services. So now the data becomes an asset for that particular platform to engage their users, but it also now stops the platforms to provide additional services that they can offer, uh, or they could offer. And that is where there's a sort of a silos that are created with immense data. And uh, the and we in Digital Green believe that there is a value that can be generated by collaboration of at the organization level, and that is where the trust and compliance issues come into picture. uh, and obviously at a very systemic level, uh, there's lack of standards, or even at the models. So if I have, let's say, to give an example of the locust that was just taken, I
Mhm.
have to take that if I have some model and I have to give it to the farmer, I need to get the information about the location and the contact information of the farmer himself or herself, and that is a PII, uh, which I just cannot exchange easily. So how do I provide that service? How does that data move from the research? There are these models about different diseases by different organizations, research organizations across the globe that have been developed. And we have seen, even with the open data, the output of these models, if we have to take it to the last mile, there are various hurdles, even with the open data that is out there. And then there is obviously immense, unlocked potential, I would say. And when we think of resilience, I think making this kind of a connected system at a deeper level, at a very protocolish level, is what we think is the need of the hour.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So you're saying there's no lack of data. There's a lot of data out there, but the organization of the data into something useful, particularly for the last mile, is missing. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Uh, and there are different there are different, I would say, institutions who want to provide that service, but they
Yes.
lack the access themselves. So it's about a collective uh,
Okay.
collective access, I would say, of the entire ecosystem, not just the farmers,
Okay.
but all these service providers, which includes government as well as development organizations.
Okay, great. I see Nora smiling, obviously feeding directly into what you are going to say. Our third panelist is Nora Maldi Risson from the Columbia University Center for Sustainable Investment. And your role, as I understand it, is aligning food sector companies' practices with sustainable development goals. So a nice follow-on from what Vineet has been presenting. Nora, would you like to go ahead and give us your opinions, your opening statement as to what you think is missing in the data?
Yeah, great. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. As you said, our project is about corporate conduct and the role of companies in driving changes across the food system. And, food sector companies have responsibilities across their entire value chains. And we have clarity on that when it comes to climate impacts in terms of scope 3 emissions. We also have clarity when it comes to human rights impacts, which includes environmental impacts on communities, as well as labor rights and community impacts across other human rights issues. So the role of companies is really important in driving change through influencing those value chains and broader ecosystems all the way down to the producer level. And so there's a lot of great work that's being done at the moment to measure and rank food sector companies in relation to sustainability, ESG, aligning with the SDGs on all those issue areas, environmental, social, and nutritional issues. Our project takes a step back and starts by asking, what should food sector companies be doing to drive improvements across the food sector? So in that effort, we're developing standards for food processing companies. So not at the agribusiness level, but at the processing level for their alignment with the SDGs. But of course, recognizing that food processing companies have a role to play in influencing actors more upstream in the value chain, as well as downstream. And so to drive private sector change, we think it's important to be clear about what that SDG aligned business conduct looks like. Because without that clarity, company reporting continues to be patchwork, and data and indicators are measuring sometimes the wrong things and miss major areas of corporate activity, which we know can undermine efforts to improve social and environmental sustainability. So to address this, we think it's important to look at all relevant areas of activity of food sector companies, and that's what our framework does. So not only their activities in terms of their own operations, which they have direct control over, but also in their value chains, as I said, all the way down to the producer level, but also in terms of their products' impacts on communities and consumers through both the actual profiles of their products themselves, as well as their marketing strategies, their approaches of entering into new markets, which we know is a critical aspect of business impact for food sector companies. And in addition to that, we also look at what we call good corporate citizenship. So this is something we know that companies play a role in either supporting or undermining efforts to achieve the SDGs. When it comes to, we know that many companies might have really great reporting, sustainability reports and commitments when it comes to their efforts to reduce emissions, while at the same time being parts of industry associations that are lobbying against climate regulation. So we take a very broad approach to considering those kinds of impacts of company engagement externally, including engagement with policymakers, engagement with litigation, and tax practices. And so we see, all of those areas as being really vital to getting a holistic picture of how companies are impacting the SDGs.
Great, thank you. So is this data open? Is it open to the public? Is it transparent? So do you mean current company data or our work? No, your work. Yeah, our work. So we're currently developing our framework of standards across all these areas. And as part of that, we're developing indicators. And the effort will be launched, we hope, at the Food Systems Summit. And some of these areas we don't have company reporting on, and we're trying to, a main focus of the effort is to try to drive coherence across different benchmarking initiatives and rankings, which mostly agree on what are the most severe impacts across the food sector. And we want to, drive more coherence in terms of what those metrics and indicators are. Great, thank you, thank you. Our fourth panelist is Dr. Dawn Cox, who's the head and the founder of Open Tech Team, which is Open Technology for Ecosystems for Agricultural Management at Wolf's Next Center, which is a non-profit research and education center. So a different part of the food system stakeholders sectors group. Dawn, thank you so much for joining us. Would you like to give us your opening remarks on what you think is missing in the system for measuring and monitoring in the food system? Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. And I think you're going to hear some echoes, but some different flavors here. And I just want to start by saying I had the privilege of growing up on a farm, but it wasn't until years after in technology, coming back to the farm that I really started to understand the deep connection between the public science of agriculture and open source in agriculture and communications to share the kinds of innovation that happens every day and every farm. And that's really our challenge, is actually taking what works locally and sharing it globally and adapting those recipes in terms of what works. So it's a really part and incredibly obviously relevant now as we're asking so much about agriculture. I don't think publicly we've really recognized that agriculture that we're asking now is much more than food, fiber, and energy. And it's, that steward our landscape is now about, not just feeding the world, but a healthier planet, which means climate mitigation and water quality and quantity and fire management and biodiversity and the nature of conflicts and migration and so forth. And so that scope, all of those products, all those values that we're trying to pay for are not in the form of calories that are leaving a farm gate. They're all data products. And they're all value-added data products that take our observations at the field level, ecological, social, economic, and translate them. That's obviously what the SDGs are about, but it starts at the farm. Like, all of those scale up. And so a lot of what we're talking about is what, Vineet and at the corporate level, at the farmer level, at the science level, how do we aggregate these? Because we're now dealing with a fundamentally applied science, a public science, multi-generational human endeavor, and we haven't built architectures to design for those systems level interoperability and collaboration. And so I think that our opportunity, sort of what's missing in the data, is a lot of the metadata and structure that you've heard about before. So, you know, we've heard other large scale public science projects like CERN, like where you have to create a structure for large scale collaboration, or the Human Genome Project, that create new data structures to allow for better exchange across boundaries. And so we're focusing obviously on data around soil health, which is about soil is not built, but it's grown, and it's actually a product of management and people. So soil health is actually a wonderful example where we're dealing with social data, economic data, what drives decisions, what's also biologically happening at the, at the fungal bacterial level, and the micro populations, plus the biogeochemical consequences that flow back in. So, I mean, I think that's the challenge here, is moving from, observed action into being able to feed that to remote sensing and modeling and back to decision support, which is why we formed Open Team, which is a global collaborative, more than 40 organizations at this point, to create a new way to enable collaboration, and are thrilled to have Digital Green's contribution in that effort as well. And we've been really working particularly on this open trusted system. But I'll just quickly run through our acronym, because we feel like the solution needs to be open to be trusted. Trust is very important, particularly when it comes to the implications of the science we're developing. A tech ecosystem, because the tech by itself doesn't do it. Technology interoperability means working together, which means people actually have to trust one another to collaborate to make these things happen. So there's a social element to that. And then ultimately, again, management, because we have to apply it to make it useful. So we have a couple mantras in terms of entering data once and being able to use that many times. But then the other thing that Vineet also mentioned is this issue of data sovereignty, which is around creating a trust and identity, who we are in the world, and that data sovereignty is core to food sovereignty and the value that we contribute, and be able to both create, attribution, sort of both control at the local level, but also attribution when we're contributing to the global knowledge commons. And so that's why I'm excited about some of the work we've been working with Digital Green on, what we're calling an ag data wallet, to help enforce and create some of that structure to enable data structure, to enable data sharing. So again, the theme here, I think, is that it's partly the data, but it's also the architecture and the structure that we build collaboratively to enable that exchange and that compounding of our knowledge together, so that we can make every farm or research farm, every backyard and windowsill and observatory that can feed into that system, and then enable the compounding of knowledge. Because individually, as Howard Buffett said, we each have 40 seasons to contribute our own observations and to learn on our own landscapes. But if we have 1,000 or 1,000,000, we compound our annual experience each year by contributing all of that public knowledge set. So that's a very high-level answer. I'm happy to get into the details with questions or responses, but that's sort of our approach, which I think reinforces a number of the earlier comments.
Okay, great, thank you. So you all come from different stakeholder groups, but there's a lot of commonality in what you're saying. So Lou's drive was, we're missing some parts of the data. But Dawn and Vineet, you're saying there's lots of data, let's get more organized. And Nora's saying you're struggling in some parts to get the data, but you're also being able to collate quite a lot of information on the private sector. But can I challenge the four panelists while I wait to see if somebody drops a question into the box, or put your hand up to ask a question in the 10 minutes we have? What would connect you? So we have a researcher, we have somebody focused on the private sector, we have two nonprofits, but particularly Vineet, you were talking about the last mile and reaching the last mile. What would make it easy for you to connect? You're obviously all sitting on piles of data. What would help you bring that together to make a difference in the food system?
Yeah, so one of the things that the initiative in Digital Green that I'm helping build up is FarmStack, which is also where we collaborate with Open Team on Ag Data Wallet. And the purpose of FarmStack is cater to trust and compliance, and also bring in the consent from the farmers. So that is where it is about the Ag Data Wallet, and it all fits in there. One way to think about is uh, the data interaction is not just one way. It is a two-way process, and in our particular FarmStack system, it's aligned with the thought of completely open source, having an interoperable standards. It's built on existing open source technologies and interoperable ontologies that define the way you can install the resources themselves. And I think there are obviously different ways the data can be brought together. What we believe is uh, on the data sovereignty, because uh, there are really the biggest problem that we see in the geographies that we work is that how do I, as an organization, trust another organization when I'm sharing the data itself?
Okay.
That and why should I just contribute everything as a data? So I think
Okay.
there has to be a way that people maintain and manage their own data. They can just
Yes.
plug in the connectors or the software through which they can
Okay.
create these automation, create these ways so that the information reaches to the relevant people. So
Okay.
it's really at an application plus application integration and the enterprise integration level.
Okay. Okay. And lots of trust.
Yeah.
Nora, there's a question for you in the chat box. Dawn, did you want to say something?
I was just going to say one of the things that that I think where we really can use a lot more data is around high regenerative systems with high biodiversity to both calibrate our mental and machine models, and in general creating from this larger data pool more authoritative data sets that we can use to calibrate and validate both low-cost tools like spectroscopy and models, as we've talked about too, that can be shared for decision support. So I think there is a need using some of these new tools to again structure that.
So what would make a database authoritative?
That's essentially a complete data set with all the associated metadata to provide the confidence in those observations. So it's the enforced protocols in the field that are in a standard set that can be aggregated across production systems, geographies, climates, and be able to then use that again for particularly spectroscopy is one of the main uses, but it's addressing a lot of the issues that we have with we have to make the cost per acre from $300 or $400 to get a high quality measurement to pennies or free as part of the public commons in terms of what's changed when. So I think that's our challenge.
Okay. Shalandra, you were asking if you can ask a question. Do you want to go ahead with your question before I go back to the panelists?
Yeah, just thanks, Cheryl. My question is, I have two questions, and one is that what I understand that there is a lack of data in terms of carbon footprints across the supply chains, as it was mentioned. So what is your suggestion? Maybe everyone can speak. What is your suggestion? How we can collect that data? And this is not an outsider agency, but how we can create system where people, the actors themselves collect that data and that can be used. But that has to be rewarded. But the value of this collection of data should be rewarded. And the second point for Nora is that you have done some work in US or maybe in Europe, but this is not largely done for the companies, and how to really make companies to follow these practices. So what has to be done at global level? Thanks.
Thank you. Nora, you want to answer? And then Luke, come in.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Nora.
maybe I'll try to answer that as well as the question that was shared in the chat. Yeah, so it's certainly true. I think that is one of the main challenges, is getting companies. We know that global companies do have big influence in their supply chains, and it's important to stress that they have a responsibility to leverage that influence in positive ways to drive the kinds of change we need in terms of practices, but also in terms of data collection. So it's certainly not, the focus shouldn't only be on those global companies, but their role can also be seen as, how they can influence actors in their supply chains. So that includes supporting data collection, that they, have a role not only in getting the information that's easy to access, that they already have access to, but knowing that data collection itself is costly to producers and other actors in their supply chains, and providing economic support for and technical support for collecting that information. And so maybe I'll answer as well the question in the chat. In terms of ESG reporting by companies, I think our initiative starts off with having concerns about the current focuses of ESG reporting and indexes that investors are being are putting out, and investment decisions are being guided by. So we see that companies that sell mostly junk food have really great reporting, do quite well on ESG metrics, and we see that companies that avoid taxes also do well. So practices like that are often not captured in ESG reporting and indexes. So that is sort of the starting point of our initiative, is to take a more holistic look at company practices. And then in terms of commitments, you mentioned, ESG commitments. So our standards start from also, setting standards for what companies should, as a first order, be committing to. But then, we have a due diligence approach to, okay, after that commitment, what is the action that we need to see in terms of implementing those commitments? So that's, first starting from assessing the baseline, where the company currently is, acting and using leverage in the company's value chains, tracking progress, reporting on that progress, and where appropriate, actually providing remedy where impacts have occurred. So I think, an important thing here is that, data is important in terms of assessing that baseline, in terms of tracking improvements. So really getting to the core of what are the outcomes for people and planet, and how do we track improvements to those outcomes over time, and making sure that data can be compared. So this goes to your last point, that companies are also quite good at spinning their activities in ways that highlight pilot programs or highlight marginal changes, for example, to the nutritional profile of one of their products. And so we see it as really important to capture data in a more relative sense, to get, what is the percentage of the company's revenue? What is the percentage of the company's sourcing that's coming from more sustainable production practices?
Good. Sure, there's plenty to think about in each of these elements. Lou, what did you want to contribute?
Just talking about the extension part, how do we collect data in a way that's going to be meaningful for farmers? And one of the more interesting things is what social media has done in recent years, in the sense that social media and phone use is currently occupied by about 2/3 of the global population. And it's anticipated in 10 more years that'll be 3/4. So if I'm a grower and I'm in South Africa and I see a potato beetle, I take a picture of it, and I have an academic social media platform that I could send that to, that tells me, oh, don't worry about it, or wait, this is new, we've never seen this before, but we know for these countries it's a pest, therefore you should pay attention to it. So to have this existing global structure as a potential platform to begin to identify pests that are going to be moving as a consequence of climate. That's something that I
Mhm.
think could be instituted fairly easily with academic, with private support as a means to begin to both identify potential demographic shifts, but also to come up with means to manage those shifts.
Okay, so one of the questions in the chat is who would actually be responsible for creating that architecture, Lou? Do you have an idea? Who would you turn to help you provide the architecture you're talking about?
There are a couple of options. One is that
Mhm.
if you go to universities right now, you can often find that for your country, you have already a establishment in place that is tracking invasives. But often it's regional or countrywide and not global. And
Mhm.
often if you can send that information to an academic, which is what is being done, then they can provide you with feedback as to what the species identification is and whether or not that's something that is a pest and needs to be constrained or be paid attention to. And that's a
Mhm.
very powerful tool in terms of pest management.
Mhm. Okay. Okay. On the other end of the spectrum, Suresh Babu asks, what is the role of the local authorities? Vineet or Dawn, maybe you have some experience of the role of local authorities and access to data?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's really key to build on existing trust and networks. And I think one of the things that we see is that digital intermediary role to translate not just language, but also
Okay.
technology from that
Right.
collection that Lou mentioned, from that
Great.
observation into a public system, but also maintaining the value and the contribution of the, that observation and
Mhm.
at the, at the edge. And
Okay.
I wanted to also reinforce sort of that role in value in creating those plans and the cropping plans, the adaptive management plans, soil health plans, all of that at the level of a farm to be useful for agronomic is far greater detail than what a lot of the models or corporate accounting or
Mhm.
global
Okay.
accounting needs. So it's really a matter
Right.
of scale and translation. So
Mm.
we're already paying in a lot of cases for that high resolution collection, but we gain more from it
Okay.
when we can put it in context and aggregate it. So I think the key really is
Great.
in that measurement, reporting, verification that they want is to
Yeah.
provide attribution and credit and actually compensate rather than paying for it again for, say, corporate use or government use, pay for it in a form that's useful for decision making to make better
Oh,
decisions that are going to be compensating
okay.
farmers not only for the data but for better outcomes.
Wow, you make a powerful statement to end our panel discussion. Lots and lots of food for thought. Thank you so much, panelists, for really setting the stage for the conversations that will follow in the discussion groups. Thank you ever so much for the thought that you've put on the table. And now back to Greg.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for moderating the panel. I'll jump in now to
Okay,
introduce the breakout sessions. So we want to hear from all of you. This is a dialogue, and so we want to make sure that you all have a chance to contribute your thoughts as well. And we are going to move into some breakouts now and hear about from you what your critical priorities and gaps are for using data for food systems transformation. So we'll ask a couple of discussion questions. What's working well in your areas of work on data collection, management, implementation, aggregation, and what's missing? Where do we need additional science or organization or evidence gaps that we can fill to use data more effectively? And we can talk a little bit about what the barriers are that are keeping those gaps from being filled, including what we identified here with the panelists about that overarching data architecture and infrastructure. Our goal is to come out of this meeting with a bit of a short list of some of those critical gaps so that we can submit the feedback from this independent dialogue to the Food Systems Summit as part of the overarching process. So we've chosen 3 breakout room topics based on your votes at the beginning of the session about the topics you're most interested in. That's greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration, food production, and then diets, nutrition, and health. So you'll be able to choose your own breakout room. And please note that we'll also be asking for a volunteer reporter to share back your key takeaways with the plenary when we come back together at the end of the session. So just keep that in mind as we move into the breakouts. Thank you so much. And my colleague Tanera is going to go ahead and open up the breakouts for us now. I'll add that if you don't choose a breakout, we will just send you to one. And you should be getting a notification popping up on your screen with options for the breakout rooms, which one you want to join. If you're not seeing it, please ping us in the chat and we can make sure that you end up where you want to go. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, click on the more button and you'll see your options. If you're still in plenary and you're not seeing an option, you can feel free to put in the chat or just say out loud which breakout room you want to move to, and we'll send you there. Doran, do you have a breakout room that you want to move to?
He is in the greenhouse gas. I think he joined from another link or something.
Oh, okay, great. He was still up on my screen for some reason.
Yeah, he is froze up there, but he's in the room.
Okay, great. For those of you who are still in here, if we haven't heard from you, we will just start sending you off. Vineet, do you have a breakout room you'd like to join?
Breakout session was, I hope your breakout session was as engaging as ours. It was really interesting. So what I'm gonna do is ask each of the groups to have the person who was the note taker report out some of the key points back to the larger group. Hopefully you all followed the instructions and had a note taker. We can go first, and then Cassie, you good to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to. I'll just share a couple of points. So I'm from the greenhouse gas and carbon sequestration group, although we talked about some overarching challenges beyond just greenhouse gas reporting. One of kind of the key points that came up is just the need to prioritize basic data coordination for the most vulnerable and for the most kind of critical emergency situations. So how to better address emergency data needs and build resilience in the most vulnerable food systems. And that a lot of times comes down to national level data collection and implementation and use. There's a lot of data collection happening from international development agencies, from kind of on-farm producers and a lot of other locations, but they're not coordinated effectively for addressing food security risks. Another thing we talked about is at the producer level, at the farmer level, a need to cater to kind of tangible benefits for farmers, develop tools for collecting data that are easy to use and that work for farmers, and to build trust so that farmers are consenting for their data to be aggregated and used at kind of larger scales. Another key gap is just the fact that technology for that type of data collection is growing quickly, but coordination hasn't necessarily caught up. There's not a clear way to translate that data into decision making, and ultimately data without a way to translate it into better decision making at the farm level and also the policy level is not very helpful. So working on that institutional country architecture to improve that is a key kind of gap right now. And then specifically on the greenhouse gas emissions side of things, we talked about the need to better coordinate the scale and methodologies for measuring emissions, because right now there's a wide range of different types of ways of measuring greenhouse gas emissions, whether some people are measuring absolute, some are measuring relative. And in order to kind of aggregate that data and compare that data across scales, we need a little bit more coordination and a little bit more of a kind of clear methodology.
Thank you, Cassie. One last point I'd add from that would be the need for adaptive management of data and data collection to be able to adapt as new information comes out. I'm going to go on to the production group. Lou.
Yeah, I was fortunate to be in the production group because we had a bunch of brainiacs, and they were really smart and they were very articulate. And so I got really wrapped up in what they were saying and didn't take as good a notes as I should have. But I'll try to summarize as best I can. There needs to be actually some of the points that Cassidy mentioned in terms of data and data infrastructure. The need to shift from what to who and how we're going to address this. There is the threat of proprietary. Things are becoming more and more proprietary. How do you share that data? How do you share it in a way that will help others? What level of social organization do you need with that? Data collection is particularly important. Building narratives in key regions that are going to be suspect or vulnerable to climate change, I think is quite important. Looking at water as one of the major resources to try and facilitate moving forward. How do you come up with management methods that allow sharing of that resource, so that within Africa, if you have rivers, how do you share that resource of water in terms of farming, energy, and so forth? How do you share that water moving from country to country in a way that facilitates production and increases management? Talking about harmonized digitally available data. That's hard to say. So, what's the computational ability of some of the models now that we have with respect to predicting extreme events or predicting what climate is going to do? And what do we measure in terms of resources that relate to productivity? Obviously, water is important, but what about things like forest cover? What about things like soil health? How do we monitor or manage in ways that will also facilitate or sustain those resources moving forward, not just with water? How do you, when you look at production, literally that's the food security key aspect for small farms. How do we maintain that going forward? And finally, sort of looking at the waste component. We recognize that waste from a developed world perspective is what we throw away in our kitchen, but in fact waste in terms of the food chain from the farm to post-harvest is also important. How do we ensure that that is maintained? And one of the, I didn't get a chance to say this, but one of the things that I think is important is storage, and how can you improve storage facilities, particularly to reduce any vulnerability that might be associated with climate change, and to include that as part of the production, as a means to facilitate production. And I'll stop blabbering, but if there's anybody in my group that wants to add something to that, please feel free.
All right, thank you. And the last group, who's reporting out for that?
Hi, I'm Lindsey Springer. I'll be reporting out for our food and nutrition group. So we also had a very productive conversation. We started off with how do we measure the nutrition of, how do we measure food nutrition transitions And in this context, we talked about the types of data that exist, consumer behavior, the accessibility of and price index of nutritious food, both locally and globally, and the role of corporations in driving positive transitions. So first, we talked about a little bit the food labeling system and what's represented on a food label and the types of interventions that have been taken. And an example was the EU traffic light system. Are they actually working? And is the types of change that's trying to be transduced actually coming to fruition? How do you look at a population, whether you're looking at chronic disease, obesity, people who are stunted in growth, and understanding the underlying network of the food system and nutrition. We talked about patterns of purchase, what drives consumer choice, and companies don't make the types of data that they obtain accessible. So we talked about there being a nationally published records of purchases in order to understand a more holistic view of what consumers are buying. But we also know that what consumers purchase at any given time doesn't necessarily represent consumption patterns as well. We don't know how food distribution is happening in a household and if different people in the household are eating the same profile of things. So there's a lot of different variables that we talked about in that regard. We talked about filling the gaps with real data. We know so much about food production, but not about the consumption. And that was really the summary of the first part of our conversation. The company responsibility of food producers also doesn't end at just providing information. We talked about companies that can provide products that contribute to the exacerbation of public health crises. And so looking at not only product information, but marketing information as part of the analysis of the public or the private sector of food production is really important. We talked about the true price of food, and there's a surprisingly large gap in the data relating the cost of food to diet. So updating the linkages of not only the discrepancies between the cost and accessibility of healthy and packaged foods, both locally and globally, but also understanding and updating the linkages of what causes disease or contributes to health. So when you're looking at very specific ingredients such as fructose, or you're looking at broader classes of molecules, updating those types of linkages to make sure that we're accurately indexing health and nutrition is also very important. We talked about data sovereignty when we talk about the rise of personalized health apps. When you talk about personal health nutrition, there's a huge barrier there with accessibility to health data. And it's talking about not just the consumer behavior, but it expands beyond the consumer into the government policies and private sector companies that drive the environment for consumer behavior. We then talked about, what's preventing the data gaps from being filled. And this typically comes back to private companies own it or individuals own it and give it to private companies. We talked about loyalty cards to stores, where stores have, personalized data that they can, purchasing data that they can then sell on for a lot of money to larger organization. It only captures one store, but it's something that is not available or accessible to researchers. This is also a very small snapshot in that it's not inclusive of developing countries where nutrition patterns are hard to capture. We know that there needs to be a strong science policy that interfaces and directs how to overcome these deficiencies. And we believe the summit needs to have a strong voice on connecting the networks for accessible and credible data, and eliminating barriers to researchers whereby a lot of the data that's very valuable is held by these for-profit data companies such as Euromonitor, Data Essential, and other types of databases that tend to sell to larger CPGs for tens of thousands of dollars reports that would be very valuable for the type of research that we are looking to make possible. And who is the data trying to influence? That's one of the fundamental questions that we talked about. There's a limited appetite for consumers to drive changes, but perhaps we can provide more incentive to companies to drive change in the supply chains that could have a longer impact for sustainability. So we know a nutritious diet doesn't necessarily relate to a sustainable diet, and that's really where we come back to some of the metrics that we talked about in the first session.
Great. It sounds like all three of these sessions were really engaging. and the readouts. I think we got some really useful data out of this. Cassie, I'm just going to actually ask you to toss up the. We're just going to, in the background while I talk, is going to be just the logos of the different Alliance Research Institution members, because I want to be sure that we highlight all 16 institutions that are part of this. And we don't have the kind of the stakeholder collaborating organizations listed yet because we're still building that network. But so part of today will feed into next week's dialogue, which is also going to be a side event for the Science Days. So what we're going to do over the next few days is take what we learned today and use that to actually drive some of the questions we're going to ask more of the kind of the science-y modeling community that will probably be on next week's call. Some of the things that I heard come out of all of these is the need for an infrastructure for integrating and sharing data, how you share it, who should be responsible for the data, issues to address aggregating data, overcoming data access and sovereignty, and the need to coordinate across scales and methodologies, and then other challenges of translating data to decision making. So one of the things that we hope to pull out of this is some recommendations for developing intermediaries for playing this role in helping to integrate data and helping to connect data to other natural sciences and social sciences for decision making and for policy development. I want to thank you all for participating. I think this has been a really interesting event. There's a lot of these going on, and so we really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join ours. I'm sure I'll see some of you for the July 7th event. If you are interested in continuing the conversation, going a little bit deeper into some of the nerdier aspect of this next week, then you're welcome to join. So yeah, we're gonna end about 5 minutes early. Maybe I'll give you a chance to get a coffee before your next call. Any other comments you want to add, Cassidy, before we sign off?
That's everything on my end. Just want to echo my thanks to all of you for your participation, and also for the panelists and keynote speaker, and Cheryl, of course, for moderating the panel. Thank you so much for giving us your time and sharing your wisdom with this group.
Yes, thank you everyone for your participation. Enjoy the rest of your week.